When my husband and I visited the Holy Land several years ago, one of the impressions that we were left with was there were stones all over the place. Stones on top of stones that made up buildings, and many of them elaborate churches. Stones on the ground, because that's the nature of the geography of Israel-Palestine. There were gorgeous, fertile fields and rocky desert grazing land for sheep and goats. Guess we couldn't call it pasture land because there were no fences. There were stones that were carved into tombs. And then there were the little stones that loved ones left on top of the tombs. Tiny piles of memorial stones symbolizing that their loved one was not forgotten. No surprise then that there are many, many references to stones in Scripture. Stones have a way of sticking around for the long term. So stones have the potential to help us remember. We'll see if they have other roles in Scripture as we go along. In this morning's gospel passage in Luke, we read that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem and was by then in the area of Bethany and Bethphage. Geographically, Jesus was between two villages near the top of the Mount of Olives, looking across a lush valley toward another hill that had incredible significance to Jesus and to every Jewish person. At the top of that hill, across the valley, was the temple in the holy city of Jerusalem, where Passover pilgrims went to meet God. Before they get to Jerusalem, however, Jesus and his disciples must walk past rows and rows and rows of graves. For centuries, the Mount of Olives has been used as a gravestone. Archaeologists say that over 1,000 years before the time of Christ, the Mount of Olives was already being used as a graveyard. Even today, the graveyard of the Mount of Olives continues to expand. Do you remember in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus calls the scribes and Pharisees hypocrites and proclaims that their intentions don't meet their actions? One of the metaphors he uses is that they are called whitewashed tombs, among other things. Can't help but imagine that at that very moment, Jesus had pointed up the hillside to the Mount of Olives with all of those limestone tombs glistening in the sunlight. Whitewashed tombs, indeed. Jesus and his followers at this point were on the road between Bethany and Bethphage. They had spent many a happy night in Bethany with their friends Lazarus, Mary, and Martha in the village of Bethany, but they would not remain in Bethany now. For Jesus had his face set toward Jerusalem. I wonder what Jesus was thinking at that moment as he paused on the road, surrounded by gravestones. But this time, Jesus didn't try to get across to his closest friends the trauma yet to come. Instead, he put into action a very carefully planned, highly ritualized, prophetic action. Some have called what was about to unfold street theater. And it started with a request for a donkey. Most of us know how the story goes from here. Jesus said, "Go into the village ahead of you, which was Bethphage, and as you enter it, you're going to see a colt that's never been ridden, so check in with the owner." There are many details in the Gospels that indicate that Jesus' entry into Jerusalem at Passover was not a spur-of-the-moment action, but as I said, a highly ritualized one that a prophet would do to make a statement. Here's the first detail. Go get that young donkey that's never been ridden. Animals that had never been ridden were used by priests for specific religious rituals. So go get a specific animal for a very specific purpose. But why a donkey? On the practical side, donkeys were certainly the transportation and delivery system of goods for the common person. Horses and camels were for the very rich and powerful, as well as the military. There was another reason Jesus asked for a donkey. Because Jesus knew Scripture inside and out, and he also knew that the prophet Zechariah had talked about the Messiah yet to come. Here's what the prophet Zechariah wrote. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Humble, triumphant, and victorious is he, riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. And the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. His reign shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. Your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious, riding on a donkey? Not exactly a kingly critter, a donkey. Most rulers like to ride in the finest cars or on the most beautiful horses in Jesus' day. But a donkey? That should have been a clue to the people about what Messiah, their king to come, would be like or not like. Not a king like the people expected, for sure. As it turns out, not a king who would take out the Romans, but a prophet, priest, king who would be victorious in an unexpected way. So Jesus played his part and made the point that he was not that kind of earthly king. If anyone had eyes to see and ears to hear, they would have heard an interesting message. Tradition of the time said that Messiah would appear on the Mount of Olives, so Jesus' disciples went and found the donkey just as he had told them, and it was carefully planned after all. They brought the young donkey to Jesus, and he rode it down the hill of the Mount of Olives, through the Kidron Valley, and up to that next hill into Jerusalem. By this time, his disciples had cut off palm branches, like we waved this morning. That would have reminded the good Jewish people of a certain psalm about kingship that began our worship this morning. Well planned this symbolic act was. As they waved their palm branches, they were singing or shouting a paraphrase of the royal psalm. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven. Luke writes that it was Jesus and his disciples. Whether it was only the 12 or 70 or even more, we're not sure. But Luke seems to be making the point that it was those who are faithful, who are honoring Jesus as king on his way to Jerusalem. There was no room in Luke's prophetic street theater for unfaithful, hypocritical people who would later be calling for Jesus' death. And here's the point where stones rejoin this part of Jesus' story. Some Pharisees heard the disciples' loud praise of their king, and they told Jesus to tell them to stop. Why were they so concerned? Were they just embarrassed at this show of over-the-top ecstatic praise? Maybe. Or were they legitimately afraid for Jesus' safety? Maybe. After all, it was some of the Pharisees earlier on in Luke who had warned Jesus of Herod's evil plans against him. Or were they concerned for their own skins? Terrified that the Roman occupiers would hear all this loud king talk and assume that it was all part of an act of insurrection. Any of these, maybe all of them. But certainly Jerusalem, this particular Passover, was a tinderbox, ready to explode into violence at any moment. They had been an occupied people for way too long. And Jesus' disciples were declaring him the Messiah, their prophet, priest, king. So the Jewish leaders tell Jesus to tell his disciples to be quiet. And Jesus responds, if these were silent, the stones would cry out. Of course, we know that Jesus was talking about the rocks metaphorically, but it does lead to a question. What do rocks say in other parts of Scripture? What role do they play? I think Jesus was making a not so subtle point about the role of rocks. Like Jesus, the Pharisees knew their Bible well. So when Jesus talked about the potential for the stones to cry out, he would have brought up all of the other stories of stones in Scripture. He would have brought those to mind for his fellow religious leaders. The Pharisees, like Jesus, knew the main role of rocks in Scripture were as witnesses. Yes, rocks as witnesses. Rocks could be brought as witnesses in legal proceedings in court or as witnesses to a covenant, a promise between God and God's people or between people themselves. In Genesis 31, we hear Laban say to his son Jacob, "See this heap and see this pillar, which I have set between you and me. This heap is a witness, this pillar is a witness, that I will not pass beyond this heap of stones to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor judge between us." Rocks were also witnesses to places where there had been amazing divine encounters. Rocks marked places, to put it simply, where people had met God in powerful ways. You may remember that it was that same Jacob who had had an incredible dream, a dream of a ladder up to heaven. And he met in that dream the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. Jacob was so stunned and awed by this encounter with the Holy One that he took that stone that had served as his pillow, poured oil on it, blessed God, and turned it long way up, we assume, because he made the stone into a pillar and called the place Beth-El, the house of God. The stone marked a holy encounter. Rocks were also witnesses to God's saving power. In 1 Samuel 7, the Philistine army was bearing down on the Israelites. They were terrified and cried out to God for help. God heard their cry, and Scripture says that God threw the Philistines into confusion, and there was thunder. We don't know the whole story, but we have the impression that God's saving act was beyond their understanding. But oh, they understood that God had saved them. So to recall God's saving act, the prophet Samuel gave the people a long-lasting symbol. Samuel took a stone, set it up in the area of the would-be battle, and named the stone Ebenezer. Translation of Ebenezer: by your help, wrong one. The Lord has helped us. The Lord has helped us. I got ahead of myself. You may have heard Ebenezer in that hymn. The hymn, "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I'm come." Oh yeah. The rock is one example of many where the people have a stone witness to a particular saving act of God. Other such stones memorialize when God led the people safely out of captivity from Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, and later the Jordan River. Now, returning to the story of Jesus riding into Jerusalem, Jesus says, if these people were silent, the stones would cry out as witnesses again to God's liberating, saving power. Jesus' symbolic ride into Jerusalem is the beginning of the next chapter of the story of God's liberating power, but in a totally unexpected way. Jesus' journey to Jerusalem began in a graveyard, and as most of us know, this part of the story will end in a graveyard. But that great stone covering Jesus' tomb would witness to something too. Another act, God's greatest act of divine deliverance and salvation. But I'll let Pastor Brad tell that part of the story next week. Jesus, tell your disciples to stop. If these were quiet, the stones would shout out. And so they have throughout the ages. And so they will again as witnesses to God's amazing, saving power. Let's join them.